It's just like, well, I'm working late. I was going to say it's like a regular day. I'm trying not to make working late a regular day so much. But I am working late and I am stitching on quilt sleeves because these are the quilts that I was supposed to have already sent to my publisher. Sorry. Um, but I need to get the quilt sleeves stitched down. So I thought I'd hop on here and chat with y'all about quilt sleeves and get them stitched down while we're hanging out. So, um, office is starting to get a little messy again. Got the long arm behind me. That's the Baby Lock Gallant XL. Um, hey friends. Everyone's coming on in. So I thought I would finish up this quilt sleeve and then show the process of stitching down another one. Now I have done videos where I talk about attaching the quilt sleeve. So the top of the quilt sleeve, I don't know if you can see it, but it's the top of the quilt sleeve is attached in the binding. It's attached at the same time as the binding. And then the bottom part of the quilt sleeve has to get just like whip stitched on by hand. Doesn't need to be pretty. This is the part that really nobody sees. And in videos where I've talked about quilt sleeves, people ask, like, what is a quilt sleeve? What is the point of a quilt sleeve? Well, a lot of times you won't put a quilt sleeve on a quilt because like the a quilt that is going to live its entire life on a bed or on the back of a couch or like as decor in a in a basket, or it's going to be like on a table. Um, those quilts don't need quilt sleeves. The quilts that need quilt sleeves are the ones that are going to ever be hung up. And my hope is that these book quilts will travel around to quilt shops when the book comes out this fall. And I hope that some quilt shops would want to hang them up in their shop as like promotion of the book and maybe of trunk shows for the book. And so they'll want quilt sleeves. Also, the publisher is going to take really pretty finished photos of these quilts, like flat lay photos, and having a quilt sleeve on there will make it easier for them to hang the quilt and hang it straight. Um, Now, most quilts are not book quilts, so why else would someone need a quilt sleeve? Well, the most common reason, and the first reason that I ever started, actually, it's not the first reason I ever, we'll back up to the first reason I ever made a quilt sleeve. But the most common reason, and usually the first reason that people need to make a quilt sleeve, is if you enter a quilt in a quilt show. When you enter a quilt in a quilt show, if it's over a certain size, and the certain size is like mini, but if it's over a certain size, they will ask, and actually not just ask, they'll require that you put a quilt sleeve on the quilt so that it can hang in the quilt show. Um, and that's just about any size quilt show because they don't want to pin your quilt. Usually quilt shows are done in at like event spaces that have what's called pipe and drape. So it's like big, like tall pipe with like the kind of thin curtains on it. And some folks will pin their quilts. Like if you go to a show and you go through the vendor hall, you'll see people sometimes have quilts pinned to that drape, and they're not supposed to. It can put, like, those pins can put holes in the drape. It's not good for it. It pulls on it and hangs on it. But the right way to do it is to have a quilt sleeve. So it's just I mean, it's like a sleeve on a shirt. It's got a hole on either end, and instead of putting an arm through it, a pole goes through it, and then it hangs off the pipe and drape with S hooks. So the S hooks hook on, they like hook onto the pipe and drape, and the bottom of the S hook hooks onto the pole that's in the quilt sleeve, and that's how it hangs up. So if you have quilts that you want to hang up in your home, um, that you're planning on having them be wall hanging pieces, then adding a quilt sleeve is an idea and a nice way to hang them up without having to um, tack them up and put holes in your walls and pins in your walls. If you have a spot in your house where you like to swap out the quilt and have like a seasonal quilt, like maybe you have a winter quilt up right now and you're gonna have a Valentine's quilt up soon, and then maybe after that you'll have like a spring and an Easter quilt and a summer quilt, and you like doing like rotating quilts, instead of constantly pinning quilts into your wall and tacking it, you can have a more permanent rod of some kind. Um, sorry. Yeah, you can have a more permanent rod of some kind to pull up and down. And some people use like the rod that has the little like clippies along the whole thing, and that's another option. Um, but this is like a more invisible way to hang a quilt, and it's easier than trying to like it's a bigger pain to put the sleeve on, but once you have the sleeve on, it's easier than trying to place all those clippies evenly along the top of a quilt. Though at my house, I have one of those rods with the clippies on it. And when you walk into my house, you see a quilt. And it's actually been the same quilt up there for years and years and years. Maybe I'll swap it out at some point. Okay. I don't know, we're just used to seeing that quilt that's in my entryway. Okay. One down, or one more down. All right, let's get to questions and say hi. Because it was too far away to see. Hi, Angela. I miss your guts too, but I'm glad we got things sorted. Hi from Imperial. Do you put a quilt sleeve on after? So you can put the quilt sleeve on. And I have a video that shows like the 2 ways to put on a quilt sleeve. So you can put the top part of a quilt sleeve on with when you put on your binding, if you plan. And almost all of these have that. There's one that I didn't realize I was going to do quilt sleeves, and for that one, you make the sleeve and you have to sew it top and bottom. So you can do it after. If you have a quilt that doesn't have a sleeve, you can totally add a sleeve after. But if you know you're going to want a sleeve, it's actually less work in the long run to add the sleeve when you do the binding. Hi, San Francisco. Hi, Mom to Furry Monsters. Hi, hi. Done a wall hanging with my first quilt sleeve that asked for 2, but I only put 1 on top of the wall hanging. Okay, so sometimes people will put like, this is my whole quilt top here, and they'll put like 1 and 1. But I just put 1 long quilt sleeve because I think it's easier. Because really, let me get this a little closer. Like the end of the quilt sleeve here is finished, and if you do 2, then you have to like do more finishing, and I feel like that's more work. So I don't do 2, I just do 1 across the whole top. I'm popping on late, so you're not late at all. We've just been here a couple minutes. This was not a planned live. This was just I'm hanging out. I'm gonna go grab another quilt and bring it over, but this is just I'm hanging out, and let's chat while I work. So it's not a planned live. What's my favorite thimble? This is my favorite thimble. This is the Dritz thimble. In the US, it comes in green. Overseas, depending on what size you need, and I think mine's a medium if I remember right. I don't see the marking on here. But depending on what size you need, they come in different colors. And it was like a purplish. Oh, here it is. My size was this purplish color. So when I was overseas, I was at a quilt shop in Holland. I got it in purple. So, but it's the exact same thing. It's the exact same thimble. And I like it because this darker part, or this purple part, is squishy. And then it's also got these holes, so it's vented. It's not as sweaty. But this part right here is hard. So this is my favorite thimble. Will this be available for replay later? It absolutely will be. Yes. It'll just like go up and stay. All right, I'm gonna get started. I'm gonna bring another quilt over and lay it out so that we can sleeve up another quilt. So I'm not supposed to show you the fronts of these quilts because these are all quilts for the book that comes out this fall. I got word that the book has been all approved, which is so exciting. Like it's all submitted, it's all approved. Now it goes into like layout, and that includes them taking the photos of the quilts, which I need to send them the quilts for them to do that. So alrighty. Hiding users from the channel because they can't keep nasty comments themselves. And of course, they wait till I step out of frame for a second. I can't wait for the book either. It's so good. It's so good. Okay, so this is the very top of the quilt. I'm trying not to show you the actual quilt. This is the very top of the quilt, and this is the sleeve. So it's just a tube that was sewn in to the binding. I usually sew it in, like I'll either sew the binding to the front and not bring it around to the back yet, and then add the binding and or add the sleeve and then add it to the back, or I will stitch the sleeve on and then stitch the binding all the way around. So I do it in 2 steps. I don't like sew the binding on and the sleeve on at the same time because there's just so many layers for it to go through. So I do it in 2 steps that way. But and then it gets stitched down. So it's like a big, yeah, it's a loop. It's just a loop, and it goes. It's a tube. It's a fabric tube. I have one. Here's one. So here's one that's not attached to a quilt. This one has been sewn across the top. So instead of being sewn across the top, that would be sewn to a quilt. But this one is going to go on a quilt that I didn't like. That I didn't put it in with the binding, but it would be the same thing. It's an 8.5 inch strip that is sewn either across the top or sewn like into the sleeve across the top, and it's just like you could put your hand. It's just a tube. It goes all the way, however long your quilt is. And then this one, because this is just getting tacked on the quilt. I didn't finish the ends. I'm just using the selvage ends because this is just a little bit shorter than the quilt. You want it a little bit shorter than the quilt on each end because you don't want it to show on either end of your quilt. So it's attached at the top, but if you put the pole in right now, the quilt would just like the sleeve would show at the top of the quilt, and you don't want the quilt to show, the sleeve to show. You want the sleeve to just be hidden behind. So you have to stitch down the bottom end. Now let me bring you down here for a second. Can you see? Yeah, okay. So if I were to leave it flat like this and stitch it down, then when the pole goes through here, what would happen, let me see if I can show this with my thimble, or not my thimble, my spool of thread here, because the pole is, me, there we go. So the pole is like a thick, like a spool of thread. So it's just longer. And you can see there's this big lump. And if this was all stitched down right here without any extra fabric here, then that lump has to go somewhere, and you would see the lump not just on the back of the quilt, but you'd actually see that lump on the front of the quilt, and it's not attractive. So we do this step here where I get my iron spin on. I'm going to just bring this up. It's a little trickier to do. There we go. Bring this up. I'm going to make sure the bottom layer stays down and just the top layer comes up. There we go. I'm going to press this. Now I also like to make my quilt sleeves out of the same fabric that I used for the backing, in part because it's like it's invisible, or it blends in better. It's not this big stripe of color on the back of a quilt. It's just, it hides in. And also because when I'm trimming up the quilt, I have extra backing fabric, so it just makes sense. And the backing fabric is as big as the back of the quilt, so it just makes sense to just go ahead and cut an 8.5 inch strip of that backing fabric, finish off the ends, and then I have the big tube for my quilt sleeve. So I'm bringing this up to this top edge of the binding here, and what that's going to do, as you can see, is it creates the 3D that I need. So now when that pull goes in here, even with this stitch down, it's going to grab the slack from up here where I brought it to the top of the binding. And I don't go any taller than the top of the binding because sometimes the pole isn't a big thick tube. Sometimes it's like a metal slat, I guess, for lack of a better term. And I don't want that metal slat, it won't take up as much of the fabric. And so I don't want my sleeve to be visible at the top of my like peeking over the top of my binding. So if I don't let it peek over the top of my binding now, then when it's all sewn down, it'll never peek over the top of my binding. Okay. Charmaine asks, is it like a drapery loop? I don't know what a drapery loop is, so I don't have that information to tell you, but maybe, could be. Yeah, so Angela says she's always hand stitched on her quilt show sleeves, and it's been a pain. And by stitching it into the binding, it gives me, well, first, I'll show you the other one. When you are hand stitching on a sleeve, there's some extra steps that you need to take, because like right now I'm ironing it up to the height of the binding. And you do all that ironing before you sew it with a traditional sleeve. So I'll show you in a second the traditional type sleeve. So with this sleeve, I had to crease, so you can see a crease on this side and a crease on this side, and those are the creases that I'm going to use when stitching on the sleeve, so that, see how it has that D shape. Like this side is flat, and that'll be what's flat up against the quilt, and there's some give on the other side. So that all has to get like measured out, and you have to like press it 3 times, and here I'm only having to press it once, so that takes less time. However, if this quilt ever becomes a couch quilt, then you have to make some decisions, because you got a sleeve on the back of a couch quilt, and that's usually not a big deal. I mean, you could cut it off, but then you would have raw edges. You could remove the top binding and then reattach the top binding, and that would be the cleanest way to do it, but then you'd have to rebind the quilt. Or you could just leave the sleeve there and sew the holes closed on either side. Or you could just leave it completely, and it's not hurting anything, it's fine. But if it's a quilt that's going to have like bed purposes or couch purposes, it's going to be a functional quilt rather than a decorative quilt. This is like putting it in the binding is a much more permanent way of having a sleeve. And like, let's say that your quilt, you're like really done with that quilt, and now you turn it into a quilt coat. Well, now you've got this weird lumpy fabric on a binding edge of your quilt coat. Like, that could be weird, but you know, that's future me's problem. Today me says, I made a quilt sleeve much faster. And today me is very excited about faster quilt sleeves. So sometimes today me thinks about future me's problems, because, well, okay, so today me has attached these sleeves to these quilts so that future me can send these quilts out to quilt shops to be able to promote the book when the book comes out. So today me was thinking of future me, just not future me. Better Betty said, I was just asking in your comments about the quilt sleeve. A couple people have asked. It might have been your comment that had me say, you know what, as long as I'm sewing on quilt sleeves, let's have conversations, because it's easier to just have a conversation than it is to try to like type it out in the comments. Sometimes text just, my thumbs typing comment text is not as effective. Do I have readers on my head? Yes. Did I put them on to be able to thread my needle? No. Why? Because I live life on hard mode. I don't know. It's a Matchbox Cars tunnel if you use it on a couch. There we go. It's just like a secret grandchild hiding spot. Just don't put snacks in there and forget about them. You can totally put snacks in there, just don't forget about them. Oh, look at that. Mom to Fur Monster says, sounds like a good snack. See, is there a minimum maximum size of the loop of the sleeve? So there is a standard for quilt shows, and the quilt show standard is to do an 8.5-inch strip with a 1/4-inch seam allowance. So that is the quilt show standard, and as long as you're going to do it, just follow the standard. Why is it standard? I don't know. Like, I'm sure that predates my 30 years of quilting. It just, that's what it is. You do an 8.5-inch strip. And I have a video where I show 2 different ways to put on quilt sleeves. And I keep forgetting what size to cut the strips because I looked it up and did the research before doing that video. So the video has the accurate information. But I kept forgetting. So now I've written it up on my bulletin board. And that way I don't have to go rewatch the beginning of my video every time to find how big that strip is. Okay. Do you ever use triangles in the corners for holding a stick? Yeah, totally do. All the time. But not for this purpose. This is to send out to, this is for like hanging quilt shows or sending to shops. So this is like a standard quilt sleeve. I have a video that does the triangle corners as well, and they're cool. In fact, we'll show you the back of this quilt. I use triangle corners basically just like that for my labels. So there's my quilt label, but it's a pocket like this, and for a smaller quilt you can put a stick in and it would sit right here, and then if this quilt was, a couple feet, that would be fine. But you need a stick that's like pretty close to the right size, so that won't work for quilt shows, because sometimes their stick is like longer and it won't fit. If the stick is too long, it won't fit. They're not going to cut down all their sticks for all the different size quilts. Okay, I'm going to bring you all down to see what I'm doing. Okay, so I went ahead and I buried my thread and I just did 3 stitches in place here. And now I'm just gonna, I'm being lazy the hard way, which is totally a thing, and I got a thread long enough so that I don't have to rethread my needle, so it's long enough for the whole top of the whole sleeve, which is lazy, so I don't have to rethread, but I mean it's the hard way because I have to pull the whole thread through every time, and if it knots or tangles or breaks on me, then I've done all this extra pulling through for nothing. But now I just whip stitch it on, and I'm making sure to not grab the front of the quilt. I'm just grabbing the back of the quilt and then the bottom of the sleeve. And for this one, I'm whip stitching it this way. If you wanted to make it more invisible, you could do this, which is where the stitches on the front and the whip stitches on the back. I'm going to flip the camera around in a second so y'all can, so I can make sure that you're seeing what I'm seeing. This takes a little longer, and I'm trying to go fast. I'm going to show you why it takes longer. All right, so I'm going to show you the ceiling, flip you around. There we go. Okay. So the reason that's trickier is because I've got quilting coming up right here, and now I need to get through just that back layer and through that stitching of the quilting without getting my needle into the front of the quilt. And so I feel like it takes a little longer. See, there's the hard way, because there's those thread knots. There we go. So you can see this is much more invisible than that. So personal preference, how much time you have. This is obviously prettier, and that's probably, this is the method I should do. because these are basically permanent quilt sleeves. This method is easier to rip out for a temporary quilt sleeve, but these are sewn into the bindings, so they're permanent quilt sleeves. So I should do it the right way. Make it all invisible and pretty. Like I know what I'm doing. It feels like a lot of work though. Oh, come on. See, the hard way. Thread knots. Thread knots. Angel says she likes the quilting. I like the quilting on this one too. This one I almost Sashiko stitched. Almost did it on the Sashiko machine. But then I ended up doing these big bubbles instead. I almost want to make this quilt a second time and Sashiko stitch it because I do think that this design would look really cool on the baby lock on the Sashiko. Marsha says, everyone please remember to like the video so the algorithm will notify more people. Thank you. See, some of y'all make better YouTubers than I do. So like the video, subscribe if you haven't already. For those who aren't watching the subscriber count, I don't blame you, but we're at 81,000 subscribers. So we've actually made a lot of progress lately. It's really exciting. With a little luck and a lot of work, we should hit 100,000 subscribers this year. And that's a really big deal for a quilting channel. It's a really big deal for a quilting channel to hit 100,000 subscribers. Yes, Adam, quilts are lots of work and time. I've done a lot of bags in my time. I have a whole book. I have a whole book on bags. That was actually the last book that I wrote. It came out in the fall of 2023. It's called Sewing Perfect Little Bags and Totes. Thanks everyone for the congrats. It's progress. So you can see, because I picked such a long thread, because I'm trying not to have to finish off an end and start a new end. I have to do the extra step of trying to keep it from tangling. Is it worth it? I don't know. I don't know. Are you just attaching? Let's see. Tammy asks, are you just attaching to the fabric you are working on, or does it go through the quilt? It does not go through the quilt. So it's just getting into just this layer of backing fabric. You can grab a little bit of the batting, but you definitely do not want to go through the quilt to the front of the quilt. So, because if you went through the quilt to the front of the quilt, and I'm just going to show you, you won't get much from the front of this quilt. You would see like a line of stitching across the front of this quilt. And that's the whole reason that we're doing it by hand, is so that, because I could like totally sew this down by machine, but then you would see a line of stitching across the front of the quilt, and that would be really unattractive. So we don't want to do that. So we're just grabbing the very back layer. It's definitely worth it to have it look right, to not go through the front of the quilt. There is a way, like you could fold. So, okay, I don't do it because it's so finicky, but it would be way faster. Maybe I should just try it since I do have a stack of this that I need to get done. But it doesn't look as nice as this like invisible stitching, but I could take this quilt and fold it like this and stitch just the so if I folded it so that the edges, and it would have to, it's so finicky because you have to like pin it just right. And now if I stitched on the very edge of this quilt sleeve right here, like with a sewing machine needle, as long as it was lined up just right, it would just grab the back because of the thickness of the quilt. And it would probably not grab the front. It might in some places. So it wouldn't be perfect. Or, you know, if I wasn't perfect, it wouldn't look perfect. And you'd see some of the stitching on the front. But there is a way to do it by machine. But you have to, like, I would glue baste this down to do that rather than pin it, because I think it'd be too hard to pin. So I would glue baste the quilt down and then run it through the machine and stitch it on. But it wouldn't look as nice. It really wouldn't. So I'm just trying to get these stitched on. So we're going to stitch this one on. It'll take me about 10 minutes here. And then we'll say goodnight. Does this stitch have a name? It's like, well, basically it's a whip stitch, but the other way around. So this is the whip stitch that I did before. So I'm basically doing this exact same thing, but here, instead of here, the whips are showing on the front, and now I'm doing the whips so that they're in the fabric. So I don't know, it might have another, it probably has a name. I don't know what it is though. Like a blind hem stitch. I'm a quilter, I don't hem. I don't know. Clips may work better than pins. Maybe. I feel like trying to fold it so that this was all smooth. I think glue basting would probably be the best bet. But we'll see. I was hoping to get these all done today, but I had too many other things on my plate. So if I can get through half of them today. My goal really was to get through half yesterday and half today, but I did other stuff on the to-do list yesterday. All right, so this one, it's really close by this quilting. So I'm just going to check on the front to make sure that it's not, that the needle didn't show on the front. Because that's more likely to happen. When the layers have this fullness here, it's easier. Move this so you can see better. Like here, it's easier to grab, but here where the stitching is, it's harder to just grab that back layer. So every now and then. Oh, yep, see? You can see the needle went through right there because it's this stitching right here. Yep, and now it's not. Angela says she loves glue basting. It's the best. It is the best. Yeah, it's not a lot. Okay, so a ladder stitch is actually different because a ladder stitch grabs from the bottom like this. It has, like, it runs across the bottom, and then you go up into the top, and then you run across the top, and you go down to the bottom, and you run across the bottom, and then you go into the top, and you run across the top. And I know that, but like a ladder stitch, when you open it up like this, you can see the rungs of a ladder, and that's why it's called a ladder stitch. So I know it's not a ladder stitch, which is not helpful for me to be able to tell you what it's not, but not be able to tell you what it is. Sorry. That's not helpful. But I don't know. It's just like stitch every more than a 1/4 inch, less than 1/2 inch. It also can depend on the weight of your quilt. Now there are some quilts that are like really big. Like big as in both wide but also tall, and especially that are like intricately embellished. So think applique, maybe braids, like stitched like decorative trims, beadwork, right? Quilts can get really heavy if you get really ornate. So if you think of some of the ones that we've seen at quilt shows that are just like, oh my gosh, that took them 6 years to make. Those kinds of quilts, they'll actually put more than one sleeve in the quilt. So they'll put a sleeve at the top, and then they'll put one part way down, so that the entire weight of the quilt isn't all getting put just on two seams right up here, right up here. They add another set of seams, another whole nother sleeve to suspend the quilt so that all of that weight doesn't go on just the sleeve at the top of the quilt. It's a mystery stitch. Blind hem stitch. It could be a blind hem stitch. That may be right. I have to do this on 2 quilts entered into a show. How timely. Well, I have a couple of videos that'll also take you through the steps in more detail, but here we're just doing the back and answering questions, because questions are always easier to just like speak them out versus try to type them into a comment. So, and since I was doing it anyway, I thought, well, what better time to talk about sleeves than when I'm doing sleeves? Denise, it's my pleasure to explain the ladder stitch. So the ladder stitch is great. Like, I use the ladder stitch when I'm sewing things closed. So that would be like the holes at the bottom of bags, the holes that you use to turn bottom of bags. Like nowadays, I just sew that on the sewing machine. I don't worry about it being visible. But if you wanted that invisible, you would use a ladder stitch there. And then when I do pin cushions, and I have a pin cushion here, so you should probably be able to see a finished ladder stitch. Okay. This is pin cushion. And okay, this was done by sewing machine. This was done by sewing machine. This was done by sewing machine. And this, because I can just see like a thread here, and then there, that one's kind of at a slight angle. This side was actually done with the ladder stitch. And it's just not perfect. So you can kind of see a couple of the stitches, but that's a mostly okay ladder stitch versus like done by sewing machine. Adam says it's a lot of discipline. I don't put the sewing the sleeve on, the making the, I missed which part. Y'all, the video always is like on a lag. So you hear me a couple seconds after I talk, and then you have to actually type, and then you hit enter. And so by that time, I've gone like 6 conversations further already, and I don't remember what we're talking about. So I don't, but quilts take time. And that's okay. I mean, if they were easy, everyone would do it. I think everyone should do it anyway. It's not that hard. It just takes time. Oh yeah, I can feel it. I could feel that the quilting was catching. So I've done a ladder stitch to stitch on my binding because I like how invisible it is, but I've actually moved to this stitch that I'm doing right now for my bindings when I hand sew bindings, because this is stronger. And I had a quilt that I gifted that I ladder stitched. And after a couple of washes, the binding started coming undone, and the giftee did not want to tell me because she thought she'd ruined the quilt. And she hadn't. I mean, it was fine. I found out from like another family member saw it and said, "Oh, I can restitch that down." And she's like, "Oh, can you?" Because I was so worried that I ruined it. And it's like, no, it's not ruined. Just the so. But now, pretty much all my bindings are machine sewn down. I don't have the patience to hand bind all, like, I just would not get the number of quilts done that I need to get done if I hand bound all my quilts. In January alone, I bound let's see, it was 10, hold on, 11, 12, hold on, 7, 8, 9, 10, I think it was 11. I think it was 11 quilts that I bound in January alone. So. Angela says, girl, you don't have the time. Yeah, I mean, it's a lovely thought. But at the end of the day, if I'm like snuggling, watching TV, I just want to snuggle and watch TV. I'm done sewing for the day. So yeah, if I could get away with doing this by machine and have it look halfway decent, I probably would. And maybe I'll work on developing that skill because I've decided that my quilts really need sleeves at this point. It's so nice when I take the photos for my pattern covers to have a sleeve. It's easier to get them to be held up, to be able to take nice flat photos for the pattern covers. You don't have someone's fingers like holding up the top of the quilts that I have to try to Photoshop out or either leave in because they're cute. I mean, they are cute, but it's just having a sleeve is, at this point, the better option. And that way they can get sent off to shops to be able to show the quilts. And they already have sleeves, so the shops don't have to worry about putting pins in my quilts. They can just put a pole through the back and hang it up with the nice sleeve. The quilt community invented full machine binding for good reason. Yeah. And I think there's people who like to poo-poo machine binding because they don't like the way it looks, and that's fine. I promise not to machine bind any of their quilts for them. How's that? Is that fair? They are welcome to hand bind every single one of their quilts, and they can even come hand bind some of mine if they want. And I promise to never machine bind a single one of their quilts. I think that's a fair trade. I heard someone else say that there's really like two groups in the quilting community, because quilting is a hobby and we do our hobbies because they bring us joy, and there are two different groups that get joy in different ways. And there is one group that finds joy in the making. It doesn't need to be perfect. They just like making it and they have a good time making it. And there's another group that they find their joy in it being just perfect. Like when it just like all those points come together and it just like you can tell the skill of the maker, like that's their joy. And I understand both, and I think that's on different days I am both. Sometimes both at the same day. Some days one, some days the other. It depends on the day. So I understand both. But I think when the you're not going to find joy unless it's perfect group tries to have a conversation with I'm just having a good time making the thing group, they're not able to see eye to eye because, and they don't understand because we're all quilters, right? So how is it that I'm finding my joy in one way and you're not understanding? And how is it that you're taking my joy away of just making the thing by telling me how it needed to be perfect, right? So we get some misunderstanding going there. It's not great. And I think if we understand that there are two groups and both groups are totally okay and welcome, but yeah, the two groups they're not going to find joy in the same way. Let's see, find comments. Lots of binding. So fair. They're totally welcome to hand bind theirs. Absolutely. You can hand bind all the quilts you want. It's not going to hurt my feelings. Can the quilt sleeve have to be the length of the quilt or like 6-inch sleeves spread out. You can do multiple like 6-inch sleeves spread out. I wouldn't do that for a quilt show as much because like they're trying to go fast. Like for quilt shows, you have to fold your quilt a specific way and have the label like the corner on a certain side of the quilt, because they're going fast. They're grabbing that quilt, they're throwing a pole in the sleeve, and they're throwing the quilt up, and they're going fast. So like it's like multiple 6-inch sleeves would be like belt loops. So it'd be easy for them to like skip a loop or not be able to grab a loop on the belt loops. So that would be frustrating for them. So I wouldn't do multiple short sleeves for a quilt show. I don't think they'd appreciate that. But for yourself, absolutely, you totally could. I wouldn't do multiple 6-inch sleeves because I know it seems tedious, like I'm sewing across the whole thing. But I'd have to finish the ends on each one of those 6-inch sleeves and not have raw edges on the edges of those 6-inch sleeves. And to me, that's more work than just sitting here and sewing across the whole top of the quilt. So that's me. And then also now it's secure across the whole top. I don't have to worry about it not being even. Yeah, that's me. I bet they don't have bad arthritis in their hands. If I had to do it by hand, it would not get done. Yeah, that's totally fair. I think there's people that you can pay to like bind your quilts. Maybe I should find some of those folks, but also like I like binding my quilts. I just like doing it by machine because then it's done. And also it's super secure when done by machine. Yep, just make it. I'm in the group where it just keeps me sane. Yeah. Like, it helps me feel accomplished. I did a thing. I made something. I've added something beautiful to the world and functional. It's a quilt, right? Doesn't matter, like, how it looks. It's going to keep you just as warm. Yep. My machine stitches closer to perfect than I do. Well, I mean, we don't have cogs and wheels in us, so that would make sense. Mom Safari Monster says, I appreciate perfection of others, but I just glad to do, perfect or not. Yeah. Oh, I love looking at people's gorgeous, stunning quilts. It's totally like aspirational, and you know, every now and then. I also say that there's a difference between a competition quilt and like a bed quilt. I don't sleep under a competition quilt. So when I'm working on a quilt, I know, is this a competition quilt? Is it a family quilt? Is it a cover quilt? Like, what is the purpose of this quilt? And that tells me how it needs to be pieced and how it needs to be finished. I hand sew the binding currently because I haven't done enough machine binding, but I haven't made very many quilts yet. That's totally fine too. Always, like, a finished quilt is a good quilt. However you got there. I love the whole process. If there's a mistake, I'm okay. Don't want to. You don't want to upset the craft gods. I understand that. So if you subscribe to my email, you got my email this morning. If you're on my email list, you got an email from me this morning. And in there is a link to a interview that I did on my very first quilt. And now I got to the end of my sleeve, so I'm just doing several stitches in place and tying off the thread and burying it. But anyway, so there's a link to Devoted Quilter, and it's my first quilt and has a picture of my very first quilt. And if you look at that picture, the bottom, when you're looking at the picture, it's the bottom right corner, one of the log cabin blocks is turned 90 degrees. It was not perfect. I'm not perfect. It's okay. Bonnie says she's never done a competition quilt. That's okay. I, for many, many moons, had not done a competition quilt. I'm going to grab another quilt and get started. So my goal is to get a couple more done tonight. We'll see. So I had done a competition quilt. I'd never entered a show. Oh, I started telling you the first time I added a quilt sleeve was actually when I worked at a quilt shop. I made a quilt that needed to hang in the quilt shop. And that quilt, because it needed to hang in a quilt shop, it was required to have a sleeve. And then I think it never actually hung in any of the spots where a sleeve was used. But hey, sometimes that's just the way the cookie crumbles. It's okay. Hold on. I'm trying to figure out how to have you here, but not like right in my face. It's a little, you don't need to see every pore. That might be a bit much. You can see the mess behind me instead. Anyway, so that the quilt shop required that any sample they made for the quilt shop had to have a sleeve. So that was the first time I ever did a sleeve, was when I worked at a quilt shop and I made a sample for the quilt shop. And I did many samples for that quilt shop, and so I did quite a few sleeves over the years. And doing that first step of ironing it down again. But I didn't enter a quilt in a quilt show for a very long time. I'd been to a couple quilt shows like early on in quilting. I went to school up in San Jose, and I was at work one day and someone came by and said, like, we were talking, they were like, oh, you're a quilter, right? And I was like, yeah. And they said, oh, there's a quilt show going on at the Santa Clara Convention Center. Are you going? And I was like, didn't even know. So the trolley, the light rail, went right by the Santa Clara Convention Center. So I took public transit over, dumped me right off right there, and went into PIQF, which is a huge quilt show, and was totally blown away. Totally blown away. So many pictures. Just loved it. So that was the first quilt show that I ever went to. And then when I lived in Las Vegas, I went to the quilt show that they had in Henderson. And a friend of mine taught at the quilt shop that I worked at the time. That's how I knew her, was she was one of the teachers at the quilt shop. And I saw her and was looking at the quilts, and I said, hey, do you have any quilts here? And she said, oh, no. When you enter a quilt in a show, they look at like every stitch. Like if you have more than one stitch in your binding, in the corner of your binding, you get marked off. And that just sounded like she was a teacher at the quilt shop. If she wasn't good enough to have a quilt in the show, like who was I? Like, so that honestly, it scared me off of ever having a quilt in the show. And I never entered. And then we moved to San Diego, and there was a San Diego quilt show, and I knew nobody here. So if I entered a quilt in the quilt show and didn't belong, like no one would know. Like no one would, like, I wasn't afraid of someone, saying that I was too big for my britches entering a quilt in the show, because no one knew me. So they didn't know what size my britches were, right? So I entered a quilt in the San Diego quilt show. Actually I entered 2 or 3 that first year. And really the reason I entered was because I found out that if you pay like an extra $5, you would get notes, like feedback from the judges. And I really wanted feedback from the judges, because when you go to Quilt Guild, you hold up your quilt, people go, ooh, what pattern did you use? And they ask you questions, and they're all excited about your quilt. But it's hard to find people who can constructively tell you, hey, do you know what would be even better? Do you know how you could like become a stronger quilter? Your areas of improvement. And so I wanted that judge's feedback. And so that's why I entered Quilts in the Show. And one of my quilts won second place. And then I entered a quilt the next year, and I dropped my needle. I have to go find my needle. I entered a quilt the next year, and I got a Judge's Choice ribbon. And I thought that I didn't belong in shows. So I haven't had time to make like a competition style quilt since, so I haven't really entered shows since. I'm hoping to enter some maybe this year. I've got a couple in the hopper that I really want to work on. So um all right. Oh dear. Now we can hear you. Okay. I'm getting marked off then. The joy is in the making, not in the ribbons of the judge comments. Yeah, no, I agree. I like because the other thing is that I've also entered in contests, not like shows, but contests where it turned out that I was the only one who entered, and I won because I was the only one who entered. So really, like you're competing, like you're putting your best up against the other best that shows up that day, and you can't control who shows up. If like multi-award winning, Paducah winning quilters enter the show, I'm not gonna win, and that's okay because they're amazing. Um, but if no one else shows up, I am gonna win, and usually it falls somewhere in the middle. So, yep. I didn't know that there were show quilts versus bed quilts. The quilt I'm under now got an honorable mention at the farm show. So that quilt that got the second place in the first show that I went to, I was standing there like looking at like God, just watching people like enjoy my quilt because it was so cool, and they were oohing on awing over my quilt, and someone said, "I just want to touch it," and I said, "You totally should. It's my quilt," and my kids have laid on that quilt, and my kids were like lower elementary school at that time, so um, it's fine. Um, but I'll pay more attention to the way the seams match or the placement of fabrics or like I'll hand bind a quilt that's going to be in a show. Like I'll pay more attention to certain details if I know I'm planning to enter it in a show versus not. So the old guild just had viewer's choice, no judging. It's an opportunity to show off your quilts. I think that's fun. Oh, when you walked away, we couldn't hear you. That's all. Oh, I have earbuds in. You should have been able to hear me, but I think they were dying, so I don't know. All right, I'm gonna find my needle. I'm gonna continue with the sleeves. I've got a couple more that I want to see if I can get done tonight. But I wanted to check in and say hi. I have a video going up on Friday. I've got it all edited and scheduled that I think y'all will enjoy. It's not my book, but it is a book, and it is a very cool book. So that'll be up. I think actually Thursday night. It'll be up Thursday night. So yeah. All right, friends, that's it for today. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up, and like I think there's hearts somewhere over here that you can like give the video, which I don't know helps in YouTube land somewhere. But yay! Thanks for coming and hanging out. Good night, friends.